wonderful case study, and we have 20 minutes before the lunch break, which is going to be exactly 1 hour, because Dean Minow will be welcoming the participants to begin the afternoon program. So 20 minutes. Sir?
So I just wanted to make a footnote to President Bok's comment about the venture fund that was started by the medical school. I was a co-founder of the second company that was funded by Medical Science Partners, and I just wanted to relate that in putting the funding syndicate together, we had the best of both possible worlds. In their due diligence, all the investors knew that the two managing partners, Andre Lamott and Joe Lovett, had been chosen by key people at Harvard. And they also knew that there was a certain degree of oversight in the investments that would be coming in, non-Harvard money, as to the overall quality of the investors. And yet, on the other hand, Veritas did not read across the byline. And in fact, the relationship to the university was so distal, so non-vicinal, that there was no perception of a Harvard influence. And in fact, had it been accused to have been such, it could have been easily rejoinded. So I just want to say it might not have been the bright line standard, but for the time, I think it was an exquisitely done process, and it's certainly had its benefits.
So via the New Yorker, I recently learned that one of my colleagues on the other side of the river had made roughly $500,000 for recording a series of lectures for the University of Phoenix. My first online system. My first reaction to this was, boy, I wish I could get the name of his agent. My second reaction was to think, this is a very interesting problem. And to use Terry Fisher's nice term, I'm just curious what you think about this. Is this the problem here that he's trading on the power of attestation of the university, but the university isn't the one to have captured this good? Is the problem that the only people who will not benefit from these kinds of recordings are our own students because they're not going to take an online course at the University of Phoenix? And is the problem that he got paid for it? Had he done it voluntarily without getting paid, just as a matter of Creative Commons, disseminating information, would that have changed matters? Or is the problem that there is no problem with that? So I'm kind of curious of your views about this, and also in relationship to Harvard's attempt to get into this marketplace.
Could you just repeat one more time? What do these professors do? That they gave lectures for a fee that are used by?
The University of Phoenix online. So it's one of our colleagues at the business school, and New Yorker wrote about this. So basically, I suppose they got permission through the conflicts of commitment policy, and made $500,000 for essentially lecturing as part of an online course. It's a very high production value online course, I should add. They hire actors to play the students and laugh at the right times and the like, which is...
And since we're talking about institutional corruption, what form of corruption on the part of the institution do you think might flow from these professors? I'm not sure I see that there's any much risk of the university doing something improper.
Well, I mean, I think one aspect, and again, I'm more interested in your views, but one thing that interested me was presumably Harvard invests a great deal in establishing the reputation, the time, and the exclusivity of this person. That is the value. You come to Harvard, you have access to this person. And now this person is basically disseminating information in a way that is giving other students the Harvard experience and the like. And so maybe you think this is not a problem, but I'm just kind of curious whether you think this is within the bailiwick of things we should be thinking about as we do edX and the other Harvard online programs, obligations to disseminate knowledge versus to capture.
Well, I don't myself. I mean, given the variety and enormity of genuine risks there are to academic values through different forms of institutional corruption, I'm not very worried about this one. I don't see much of a problem. I suppose you could say there's a very different kind of problem, that maybe the university shouldn't allow other people to make money off its own professors, some of which comes from all the reputational value these professors receive from their affiliation with Harvard. Well, you know, among the problems we're talking about today. I think that is a minor one. I think a much greater problem is whether universities ought to get in the business of trying to profit themselves from online, because there's such obvious ways in which the way to maximize your profit from online education would conflict with the best interest of the students. There you get into a genuine danger, and one in which I feel quite uncomfortable about the idea of universities doing that for profit. But I don't see that the university was exploiting anybody. If anything, it was being exploited itself. And, you know, maybe there's some sort of grim comeuppance in that, but I don't see it as a problem.
Could I just make a comment? I have a very distinct recollection, I think it's real, of some years ago, maybe a decade ago almost, there was a Harvard law professor, maybe named MacArthur, but I'm not sure. I'm right on that.
Miller, Arthur Miller.
Who was making a deal to record tape and sell his course lectures at the law school to an outside internet education committee of some sort. It was on the front page of the Boston Globe and I think the New York Times, and I thought the law school had realized that it did not have a policy that spoke to this problem, but that they created a policy that spoke to this problem. And this was after you were dean, Derek. But if there is a policy, where is it?
That's why I said on the other side of the river.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry, okay. This side.
Donald Light from the Edmund J. Saffer Center. This is a question that spans the two parts of the morning and is addressed, I guess, to President Bok and Professor Cole. I think your idea of an academic league of universities is very attractive and could be a way of collectively dealing with a range of these conflicts of interest. And I'm wondering if either one of you or others in the room know about the efforts by the Dutch to create leagues of universities. As far as I know, I spent a year in Holland, they have developed and worked through over the last 10 years 2 or 3 of these, and they're around different large thematic areas. So it's not always the same universities involved. And I know one of them is a league that does pharmaceutical research and that involves substantial contributions from drug companies. But as far as I know, it's the universities that set the agenda and control the designs. However, they must also have dealt with copyright, royalty, patent issues. And so my guess is it's a very smart country. There's a lot we could learn about the last decade of efforts amongst senior administrators and faculties to address these conflicts of interest. I'm just wondering if someone knows more about it than I do, because I only have a sense that it's a rich area.
Does anybody wish to respond? Dennis, are you going to respond to that? No?
Good question.
All right, so the question hangs. Naomi?
Naomi Sheeman, University of Minnesota. This is for Professor Marks, and it actually might come up more in this afternoon's discussion. And you mentioned the possible distortions of the research agenda. And the question has to do with the importance of peer review and the absence of peer review often in industry-sponsored research. And I'm thinking in particular of the problems facing IRBs, that when there's risk to human subjects, it's supposed to be weighed against the potential scientific value of the research. And IRBs are not really in a position to do de novo independent judgments of that. And in the case of funded research for NIH and so on, it's been through peer review that's answered that question. In the case of industry-sponsored research, often there's been no peer review. no independent evaluation of the scientific value of the research against which to weigh any potential risk to human subjects. And so it seems to me even independent of the sort of institutional conflict of interest that you're correctly directing our attention to, there are problems that arise structurally in the ability of various oversight bodies to do their job and in the diminishing importance of peer review of research.
So just to say that although I haven't expressed it in writing, I have expressed exactly the same concern on a number of occasions on panels such as this. Absolutely, and actually it would be great to put on the table, since it's been raised just now and also by one of the speakers before, the scope of IRB review. And are we asking our IRBs to do a lot of things that perhaps they shouldn't be spending their time doing, but they're not empowered to do exactly the kinds of review that one might want to do, namely to discern whether the scientific benefit of a particular study merits it. So I absolutely agree with the concern, and I've expressed it myself on a number of occasions.
Dennis?
Dennis Thompson. I don't have any conflicts that I want to disclose, but I do an observation which will lead to a question. Institutional conflicts are more insidious for two reasons than individual conflicts. One has been a reason has been alluded to several times. It's much easier to believe with an institutional conflict that the primary interest and the secondary interest coincide. That is, you're doing, if not God's work, then the university's work when you're actually helping the university to make more money. And that obscures all the dangers that Derek and others have talked about. The second reason that it's difficult hasn't been emphasized enough, I think, is that in the case of individual conflicts, in principle at least, there is always an oversight body, a faculty committee, a provost, a research vice provost. In the case of the university, there isn't, except perhaps the Board of Trustees, or as we quaintly call them here, the corporation. And I haven't heard that mentioned, even though I think that's possibly a source of ameliorating the problem, but more likely also a source for making it worse. Boards of trustees have now taken to setting benchmarks for reappointments of their presidents. I don't think, fortunately, our president, when Derek was president, wasn't subjected to that, as far as I know. And among those benchmarks are, how much money did you raise? How did the fundraising go? How many contracts are your faculty getting? And if you don't move fast enough, asked Terry Sullivan, you might lose your job. So the incentives for the presidents set by the boards are very much part of the problem. My question then is that right? But also, does that mean we have to pay attention to what the boards of trustees are doing if we care about institutional conflicts of interest? Could they be given some incentives themselves to actually address this problem?
Yeah, could I just, in the interest of full disclosure, mention that the final speaker on the program, the rapporteur, President Bakow, Emeritus President Bakow, is a member of the Harvard Corporation, and that maybe at that point you can get some direct discussion about this. I also want to interject that purely by chance, I get very curious things in my inbox on my emails. I have become familiar with an institute here in Boston, an independent institute, I'm told, called the Tellurus Institute, and I don't know much about it. But what they sent me were several studies that they've done about the defects in trust in university reporting to the federal government about their board's financial interests. I don't know anything about the quality of the research or anything else, but it would give me pause about whether the Board of Trustees was the final resting place for all of our aspirations, but I'm just throwing that out. Okay.
Can I just respond to
Yeah.
Dennis's
Sure.
point about doing God's work? So what's really striking is a couple of academics came up with the term white hat bias to critique researchers who were doing work on the impact of soda machines in schools or whatever, without recognizing that indeed, as you rightly point out, much industry work, industry-sponsored work, is framed in terms like, as you said, we're doing God's work. So the white hat bias can operate very nicely with the bias from industry sponsorship to create an even more powerful effect. And in some separate work I'm doing on public-private partnerships, what has really struck me is that public-private partnerships in research are often really justified on the basis of some incredibly ambitious and really wonderful goal if it could be achieved. The elimination of obesity in 50% of the nation's children, or if you state the goal largely enough, and it becomes simply a risk-benefit analysis, then once you make the benefits really high, the risks start to seem not substantial. So I'm actually want us to start thinking more creatively when we're talking about these kinds of engagements. Start thinking creatively about other frameworks other than simple risk-benefit balancing, right? In some cases, the risks may be so great that there should be a presumption against.
Okay, so we're now,
I'd
I'm
just like
sorry,
to add
yeah?
that I think you've touched on a very important subject, and my experience is, although I don't think there's any solid research on the subject, that the kind of goals that are set for a president and the standards by which presidents are judged by boards very often, and I think unwittingly, create stronger incentives to cut corners on values and ethics than it does to uphold them. And that is a subject I think that could use a lot more study and writing in order to influence boards to pay more attention to the fact that if you give your president bonuses based on how much money the president raises and whether you've risen in the U.S. News and World Report rankings, you are increasing the incentives to do a number of things which are not consonant with the academic values of the institution. And yet that goes on, I think, quite widely.
Okay, now I have to announce that this is the lunch break. If you all want to cut into it, we're not going to change the backside, so if you want to shorten it and a few more questions, I'll take them, but otherwise, you're free to go to lunch. So, Francis, can you be brief?
Yeah, I just, can I be heard? Is this working? It's working. I agree with Professor Marks that this is not just a question of cost, benefit, or risk cost. That was the point I was trying to make, Professor Coles. My question to you, Professor Marks, is why did Professor or Dr. Olivieri sign that first contract? Why would someone concerned with public health be under such pressures to sign a contract that said that she could not even, disseminate negative information? That's the first contract. Why did the university allow a professor to sign a contract of that sort? Is there a university oversight of contracts that individual researchers sign? And finally, if you had to try to defend her, you emphasized that the research that she was reporting was under the second contract, where there was no clause that said no dissemination. Would things have been different if she had broken the first contract from your legal point of view? And so what is the bindingness of such a contract, in fact? Because you emphasized you defended her on the grounds, in part, that she hadn't signed a non-disclosure form secondarily.
So just to be clear, I was actually not involved. So I'm not a Canadian lawyer. I'm a British lawyer. I'm an English barrister. So I was involved in the European Court of Justice proceedings. I wasn't involved in the. If that had been a contract under English law, which it wasn't, it was a contract under Canadian law, I would have felt quite confident arguing that that provision was void for public policy reasons, and that a court would come to that conclusion. But I wasn't involved in the Canadian side of it. But what I will say is that there should be a facility, and there wasn't at the time. I can't speak to what's there at UT now in the Hospital for Sick Kids, but there should have been a facility to provide that kind of expertise, legal expertise, and support for researchers entering into contracts. I'm absolutely confident that if you had, although she can answer the question for herself, I'm absolutely confident if you'd stood over Nancy Olivier's shoulder at the time she signed the contract and you said, do you know this contract could be used to prevent you from discharging your ethical obligations to your research participants? Obviously, she wouldn't have signed it, but she's not a lawyer.
Okay, I'm going to declare a lunch break. Remember, there is a big question and answer period at the end of the program later this afternoon, and plenty of opportunity. Thank you.
I knew Rob Pritchard.